Hunter, to kick off our episode today, all about trains, I have a question that I think a lot of people have an answer to, and you're probably going to have an answer to as well.
Okay. Right.
But I'm just going to go ahead and throw it out there. And here's the caveat. I think that you, as well as most people, are going to be wrong about this.
Right.
But do you know what the longest train route in the world is?
I based on what you said, I think I do, but now I don't think I do.
Hit me with it.
The one that's super famous that comes to mind is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. That's one that comes to mind.
Right. That's the one that goes from, I believe, it goes from Moscow to Vladivostok in Russia.
Pretty good trek. Yeah.
Right. It's a very long route. I have the stats here. It's run by Russian Railways, and it's about 9,300 kilometers, has 140 stops. Whoa. And if you can believe it, this is a daily service, which is quite unusual, I would say, for this long
impressive.
of a route.
Yeah.
Like there are some long routes in the United States, not quite as long as this, but long routes, but they'll still be like, weekly or like twice a week service. Right. It's not daily.
So the Trans-Siberian, there's a few of them running because it takes more than a day to get there. So every day they send a new one out. Yeah. That's
true. That's a good point. Yeah. It takes 164 hours or around 7 days to make that full journey. Wow. So again, a long time, but we're going to talk a little bit more about passenger rails, especially sort of how long it actually takes, to get through some of these long rail routes a little bit later. But while that is, I would say, the most commonly thought of as the longest train route in the world, it's actually not. It's really the longest passenger rail route, which I think is what most people get hung up on.
The other shoe to drop on that one. Yeah.
Right. So the actual longest train route, when we factor in, freight rail, is the Yiwu-Madrid railway line, which is taken from the Chinese city of Yiwu to the Spanish city of Madrid, a distance of approximately 13,000 kilometers.
Wow, that's impressive. Yeah.
So yeah, that one's actually, you can even
that went through different countries, right? Like that's right. What makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting that in my head that there's not actually a passenger rail route that maybe connects Europe to China. But then also I start to think about it. I'm like, well, you start thinking about what's the demand that's there for that.
Right.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And rail transportation, even high-speed rail, is only good for a certain amount of distance. And then it becomes less competitive with something like airplanes or air travel, particularly as it relates to the human experience, right? Because humans, we're willing to pay a premium, get there. To get from point A to point B in relatively quick, relatively short period of time is what I'm trying to say. So let's talk about why we're talking about trains a little bit. So the first thing I want to say is that, Hunter, we've done a lot of transportation episodes already.
We've done several.
We've done several. Yeah. We did. We recently did air travel, which was a lot of fun.
That was good. That was interesting.
Yeah. We've done the U.S. automobile industry, and we've have an episode on the interstate highway system here. That was from way back when.
So a double shot for automobiles. Yep.
We did the bicycle, which is
a good one.
Transportation, sort of, much more macro level. Yep. We even did an episode on the golf cart, if you remember that.
Right. That's right. That's transportation.
Yeah, exactly. It was like the whole framing of it was like golf carts as transportation. Listener, right. I usually recommend people go and listen. That one had some audio issues that we weren't able to fix, so it's a little bit of a tough listen, to be honest. But I think it's a fascinating episode. We even, with respects to rail transportation, we even have a whole 2-part episode all about high speed rail.
That was from the early days. Yeah,
from the early days as well, right? So framing it as like, what if we had this? Right. And so you can go back and listen to that. All that's to say is I think it's long overdue that trains had a proper episode where we're just talking about trains and like what are trains and how
they did the Titanic even, right? So that's transportation. It didn't pan out that great, but yeah, that was made for transportation. Yeah.
The episode panned out
the
really
episode
well.
Was a good one. Yeah, check it out. But yeah.
Yes, the actual train system, not as well. Or
Right.
sorry, not train system, the cruise.
The cruise system, yeah, they had some problems there.
But also, I want to talk about trains mostly because, well, first, I would say that they are one of the very first technologies to really allow for humans to move at a speed that is less natural and for long periods of time without stopping.
Right.
Of course, we've had ships that have allowed this as well, but those were constrained to the oceans or even rivers, right? You're not on land, which is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Right.
And so you're limited a little bit, right? Trains allowed people to zip across the country, when the Transcontinental Railroad, for example, was completed in a matter of time that was simply infeasible and not even really unimaginable, really.
Yeah, no, transform different parts of the world, because all of a sudden a trip that would take 5 weeks, you could do in a couple days or something like that. So
exactly. Again, yeah, it was an amazing transformation. They also, even to today, they also go through areas of everybody's country that a lot of people don't ever get to see, right? The only way you're ever going to get to see certain angles, certain mountains, certain areas is if you do a very long backpacking trip into those areas.
Right.
Or you ride the train.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting sort of geography. That's sort of like, if you take the train from Portland up to Seattle, for example, you're going to get some different views than you would if you drove from Portland to Seattle.
That's right. Yeah, it's a unique, and you see really some beautiful areas, and then some areas that are kind of the backside of cities and things like that, which I think are interesting.
Fascinating.
I'm always, I used to take the train on the East Coast a lot to get from my home to where I went to college in Washington, D.C. And I just remember, going through, starting in New Haven, going to New York, going through Wilmington, Baltimore, Philadelphia was there, getting into Washington, D.C., and seeing these really interesting parts by the tracks through all those cities. I liked it. I thought it was great.
Yeah. It's a different view, right? And I think to me, that's really important. It's like getting those sort of different viewing angles of different places. Because we're so accustomed to like various ways that we see and portray areas, right? I think the train helps break us out a little bit, especially in this country when we're not accustomed to traveling by rail. And so I think that's a really cool aspect of it.
More common in other places. Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's dive on in. Normally, Hunter, we dive deep into the history of any given thing.
That's right.
We just did pizza last week. We dove deeply into the history of pizza. We are not really going to cover history in this episode. We kind of already did that.
We did that, right? Yeah.
We did it. Yeah. It's been done. Go and listen to it's part 1 of our high speed rail. We dive deep into the history. You can go and listen to that and learn all about how sort of some of the very first trains came to be. You can learn all about it. I think we talk a lot about the Transcontinental Railroad,
super
all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
The caveat is that we'll do a little bit of history talk when we talk about Amtrak later in today's episode. And that's going to be more of a, recovering, because we talked about Amtrak in that old episode as well, but it kind of fits in with our overall story today. So we're going to rehash a little bit of that. But it should still be very interesting, I think, in connecting all the pieces. This also means, Hunter, that we are breaking our combo here, where Herodotus is not going to make an official appearance.
That's right. Well,
sadly.
In a sense, he just did, because you mentioned him. But he probably didn't know much about trains, although, as you pointed out earlier, somehow maybe he did. This guy seemed to know about a lot of different things. Yeah.
We'll see. If somebody's a big Herodotus stan out there, maybe they know.
We might be creating some Herodotus fans out there.
So let's keep it moving. So because today we're generally talking about trains at large, I thought it would be worthwhile to talk about just trains broadly. Overall, we can separate trains into a few different categories, mostly within 2, right? There's passenger trains, which we've already talked about. That'd be sort of your Amtraks, your European high-speed rail, your Shinkansen in Japan, China Railway, India Railway, all these things that just move us around as people, right? Get us from point A to point B. That is kind of, freight. The other side of that is freight rail, which has kind of always been in the picture as well.
Right.
Historically, trains were moving people around, not necessarily freight. There's always been a little bit of that. Today, however, at least in this country, in the United States, it's heavily shifted over to freight transportation, not passenger.
Right.
There are some more specialized trains out there, far more specialized, that we're not really going to get into, but I thought it was fun to just call them out. So, for example, mining trains, right? Trains that go into mines. These would be more commonly associated with those like mining carts,
Right.
It's kind of cartoonized a little bit. But there are actual trains that run into mines too that serve a singular purpose of going in and, it's almost like a freight system, but it's not connected to a wider system of freight rail. And then there are military trains, which I thought was very interesting. And this is something that is I don't think it's really used anymore. I didn't dig deeply into this, but this would be like a train that is on rails, but is heavily armored and has cannons and almost like a battleship of sorts, right? It's a heavily armored train. I don't know. I guess there's not really that much more into it.
Places where that's still very relevant, but you don't hear about that so much in the context of the United States, at least.
No, I know, for example, in World War II, there was some heavily armored trains that would go through the Arabian Peninsula. I don't have a lot of information on that. I just know broadly that was an aspect of how they got around and how they sort of, I think it was the British, how they sort of controlled the colonies there. It's fascinating, though. I think it's just very interesting. But for the purpose of today's episode, we're just going to talk about passenger and freight rail because the other stuff is a little superfluous and we only have about an hour. So let's go ahead and talk about trains, and sort of their impact. So, Hunter, question for you.
Yes.
In today's day and age, where we have planes, we have vehicles, and planes get us to across the country in a matter of hours. Vehicles, allow us to move very independently, wherever we want within a given area. Why do you think trains are still important today?
Why are trains still important today? Well, I think one of the things is that they don't have to compete with trucks. We move a lot of things in trucks, but we've got them. We've got the railroads already, and you don't necessarily have to compete. So there's a lot of things probably moved around in trains that would be maybe take longer or more complicated if we were using streets. And then, flying things is pretty expensive. So there's probably a savings in using a train over a jet or something like that. So I don't know if that's an answer. That's my answer.
I mean, that both of those are totally true, right? So let's run through some of these reasons, right? Because I wanted to establish there's this common idea that you see get touted around whenever somebody wants to basically create a passenger rail service, and it goes something to the effect of, this is 19th century technology for a 21st century world, or something like that.
Right.
It's like it's kind of a bunch of baloney. It doesn't really.
That's like the tagline from the automobile industry.
Right.
That's like the tag. Yeah.
The automobile is also it's a 19th century technology too. So. It's a pretty old technology. Anyways, that's an aside. But I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of why trains are important, because they kind of are. So, for one, trains are a very efficient method of moving people and goods around. In fact, on an energy basis, it is probably the most efficient method over long distances, right? So like to get let's say, from here to, Portland to Chicago, in terms of the amount of energy expended, that's going to use less energy per person than an airplane or a vehicle. So that's an important caveat. It's very efficient. According to the Association of American Railroads, railroads are the most fuel efficient, and they can move 1 ton of freight nearly 500 miles per gallon of fuel on average. Now, if you compare that to an average vehicle, which is not going to move a ton of freight, but it's just going to move some people, you're still looking at, 40 miles per gallon on the high end, right? For like a hybrid electric vehicle, 20 miles per gallon.
a tractor trailer truck or whatever,
Right.
that's not gonna.
Nosedive.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in a plane is also it's not getting
Not
nearly
getting that kind
as
of mileage. Yeah.
I don't have the stats on that,
To
but I
get
know
that
it's
thing
very
off the
low.
ground. Yeah. Yeah.
On average, railroads are 3 to 4 times more fuel efficient than trucks, and a single freight train can replace several hundred trucks on the road, right?
Wow.
I think we all have this experience, right? It's like you see the train, we're stopped at a railroad crossing, you see the train going by and by and by and by and by, and you're like, oh my God, how much longer
right
possibly be? And the reality is that they can be very, very long.
Yeah, one engine can pull a lot of cars, it turns out.
Pull a lot of cars. And then you can stack up engines, right? You can have 2 or 3 engines, and now you have more. you can have more trains on them, or more cars, I should say. And of course, trains they're pretty fast overall, right? I mean, granted, you see some of those freight, you're stopped at a railroad crossing, you see a freight train, it seems like it's going slow as molasses.
Crawling through the city sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And well aware. I mean, we have a railroad crossing here in Portland that's notorious for that. If you get stuck behind it is bad. It's not fun. But overall, trains can be very fast because, one, they don't have to sit through traffic, right?
That's right.
Trucks can get mired in traffic. And they can haul so much more, which means maybe they're not moving as fast, but collectively, all of the stuff that they're hauling is getting to places much faster at a much faster speed. So there's that aspect as well. Obviously, planes can move things far, 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 far faster. But it's also, they're very limited in how much they can move, and it's very expensive to do so. So it's just not it's not necessarily, barring some commodities, it's not really generally worth it to ship things by plane. I think during the microprocessor sort of, when there was that whole deal where we didn't have enough microprocessors in anything back in like 2021. I don't know if you remember that. I think at that point it became more costly to ship microprocessors by plane around the world from where they're manufactured, because there was such a high demand for them. So I think that was an interesting caveat
there.
Yeah. But also trains move people around too. This might not appear to be the case, obviously, in the United States and Canada or Mexico, where trains aren't featured prominently in our daily transportation. But globally, trains move people around really well. So in 2023, according to the International Union of Railways, trains carried nearly 23 billion people. It's a lot of people. That's more people than there are on the planet, but obviously people are taking multiple trips.
Yes.
Hunter, where do you think most of these trips are located? What country?
So the country that has the most passenger railroad trips.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna go with India because it's a giant country, a large population, and I think trains are a main mode of transportation. So that's my first guess.
India is a good guess. India is highly ranked, but they're not the most highly ranked. In fact, the most highly ranked is actually Japan.
Oh, I should have gotten that one. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't have the document up. Maybe I'll get that up for part 2. But I have this whole document that breaks this all down in pretty good detail based on like each individual line within each country. Japan has something like 6 to 9 billion trips per year just by themselves.
Yeah.
And when you start thinking about it, it's like, oh yeah, they are a very rail heavy country.
And it's very dependable there. So people like that. So there's a lot of motivation for taking it because they know they can depend on it.
Absolutely. For those of us in the United States, this seems like a surprising amount. We're going to talk a little later about sort of how many annual riders there are in the United States on Amtrak, but we'll save that for a little bit.
Okay.
Because we don't really do train passenger rail transportation here in the United States. It's just it's sort of the difference in sort of how we've prioritized rail over the last 100 years. But the reality is that trains are highly efficient at moving people around the world, especially in those mid-distance trips. So this is largely what countries use it for, right? It's not those long distance that Vladivostok to Moscow trip, that longest train route, passenger train route in the world. Yeah. That's not a common train riding experience for most people.
It takes a week. Not everybody's got a week to get there, kind of thing.
Not everybody has a week. Instead, what are the most valuable passenger rail routes would be something, like Paris to Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. It's a 250-mile trip. It's very efficient to go by train. You can take a plane, at least last time I checked. I know Europe is sort of trying to clamp down on these sort of smaller distance trips up by plane. But getting to the airports, respectively, going through security, all that kind of stuff, it pads on time. Driving, you have to deal with traffic. Therefore, taking a high-speed rail, or even not even a high-speed rail, can sometimes be a lot more comfortable, a lot more efficient to get you from Paris to Amsterdam and vice versa.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that if you're going to an airport, it's going to probably be, in many cases, on the periphery of the city, and then you'll fly into the periphery of the city, and you have to get on a commuter train or something else in order to get in the city. When you take a train, there's sometimes multiple stations within a city, and you get out and you're already there. So that's an advantage as well.
Yeah, let's say, so here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a rail route that will take you from Portland to Seattle. It's called the Amtrak Cascades.
Yes.
Beautiful trip. Mm-hmm. It's actually, unless there's a delay, which they are getting better about not having those, it's pretty equivalent in terms of speed by car, right? It's about 3 to 3.5 hours by train. With no traffic, you can probably make that in about 2 hours and 45 minutes by car. With traffic, you're probably looking at somewhere around 3 to 3.5 hours. And there's always traffic.
But that's more common for driving too, I think. Get there in under 3 hours. That used to be possible 20 years ago, but with the volume of traffic now, although now that the construction's done in Tacoma, because that used to be I would just be hanging out by the Tacoma Dome, just waiting for traffic to move. And that doesn't happen as much anymore after they finally finished that construction.
They did finally finish that, yeah. Tacoma Dome not getting nearly as much advertising value as they used. So this concept, though, of like these mid sort of journey trips, so Portland to Seattle, for example, even though we have one here, this is a concept that's very familiar across China, India, Japan, obviously, Europe, vast parts of Europe, a lot of different countries. But it's something that's actually been kind of lost to those of us here in the United States, Canada, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, places in South Africa, all these different places, right? This is a concept that's not super common. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that sort of in our next section. But first, we got to do our very first ad break. So
all right,
let's go ahead and do that. And we're back. This is the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about trains today, passenger trains, freight trains, just trains broadly. We just ran through a bunch of statistics. We're going to dive into a lot more statistics in this sort of part. But first, question for you, Hunter. Yes. When you think of a quote unquote train country, what country do you first think about?
Well, since we sort of went over this a tiny bit in the last segment, Japan definitely comes up. But, Switzerland and Belgium are kind of famous for also having very efficient, on-time kind of train situations. And I lived in Belgium for a year and took the train all the time. So, those are train countries to me.
Both of those are right. I think most people would. At least in our audience, which is mostly situated here in the United States and Canada, would probably think of a country in Europe. Probably based on their own experience of traveling there, whether it's France or Germany or Spain, right? These are all, I would say they're all broadly train countries in that you can board a train from almost any sort of major city or even smallish city or town and take it to someplace else if you needed to in relatively quick time frame. Yeah. And this kind of makes sense because this idea that Europe broadly is European countries are train countries, because a lot of people use them within that continent, and they use them frequently. And it's also a place that that people like to visit to have this experience of taking the train, right? It's so funny how many people that I've seen talk online, or I've spoken with personally as a former city transportation planner, about how much people love the experience of taking trains. When they're traveling abroad, when they travel to Europe, they're like, "Oh, this is such a magnificent experience. I loved it. You could just sort of hop on." And then they get back to the United States, and sort of there's a disconnect for them being able to do that here.
Right. The thought of getting on a train doesn't really come up. I mean, it's one of the best ways. We sort of touched on this before, but it's one of the best ways to appreciate landscapes.
Right.
Being on a train, and sometimes you go at different speeds, because sometimes, as we said, it's going quickly. Sometimes it slows down, but you're afforded this view into different places that you've never been before. That's one of the reasons that people like it. Plus, you can eat on the train, and you can walk around a little bit, and so it's got a lot going for it.
It's interesting. Even so, we here inside the United States, we do have a rail line called the Acela. Might not be called Acela Express anymore. Anyways, the Acela, it runs the Northeast Corridor, basically from Washington, D.C. up to Boston. It's relatively quick. It's in a very dense region of the country overall, right? It's going to go through Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York City, and it's so funny because even though that we have this, and people I know who live there or who have frequented Europe quite a bit and use the trains over there, it's just not on their radar. It's almost like they have to go out of their way to think about taking the Amtrak Acela over driving or over flying.
Yeah, well, as I said, that was the exact route that I took a lot back in the day. But near the end of college, the flights started getting more competitively priced. It was much cheaper to take the train at one point, and then it was kind of close. And so you're thinking, well, I can save myself some time, and it's not that much more. But yeah, I mean, when I was on taking the train, there's still a lot of people on it for sure on the East Coast.
Yeah, there is. Yes. Yeah.
But a lot of them are commuters, right? There's some people who do this for business and stuff. So people who do it more recreationally, it's probably a lesser number, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I would guess that would be we're not going to really dive into sort of the commuter versus recreation sort of ridership. I'm sure that data exists out there, but it's not really sort of, we don't have time on this episode to really cover that.
Yep.
Now, all that's to say, Hunter, what if I said that the United States and Canada were just as much of a train country as any of those European countries or Japan or India? What if? What if I said that? What would you say?
I would believe that because of the freight traffic that's going on.
Exactly.
In the United States, it's the freight companies that own the tracks that, for the most part, Amtrak doesn't really own so many tracks. And so, yeah, when you're waiting at a stop, you're waiting for a train, if it's an Amtrak train, it goes by in about 15 seconds, but the freight trains take a lot longer. So yeah, I think that's what's going on.
Exactly. The United States and Canada and a lot of countries actually are train countries, just not in the sort of human experience that we associate, Europe with. And again, most people do have experience with freight trains. It's just sitting and waiting for them, which is kind of an annoying experience.
Right. Yeah. That's the only visibility that it gets.
Right. Yeah. Totally. So the reality is that there are about 140,000 miles of active rail here in the United States. So this is, rail that still has trains running on it. There's a lot more that there's no longer trains running on.
Okay.
This would be compared to 161,000 miles of active rail in Europe, which includes Turkey. So I just want to make that distinction because it's not always included. So that, to me, that's pretty comparable in terms of the amount of rail. Now, obviously, Europe has more people, but it's smaller landmass. There's some other variables here. U.S. has less people, but it's larger landmass. All that's to say is it's equivalent. I would say that based on that alone, it's like, okay, yeah, the United States is matching almost toe for toe the amount of rail traffic in terms of rail line that's still active to today. Um, the reality is that the United States uses this for freight, though, not passenger. And this is kind of the inverse of Europe. Not quite, but a little bit. So, according to the International Union of Railways, the United States hauled about 1.4 billion tons of cargo in 2023, compared to Europe's 1.1 billion tons of cargo.
Okay.
Now, this might not seem like a huge difference, but it kind of is when you start looking at sort of the population differences, because for one, Europe, including Turkey, has about 740 million people, which is more than twice that of the United States.
Right.
If all things were equal, if Europe was pulling as much cargo per capita as the United States was, Europe would haul somewhere around 3 billion tons of cargo every year. And so I guess what I'm trying to illustrate here is that Europe is, even though it's much more of it is a train country, it does use its train for freight. The US is a train country as well. We've established that it uses for freight. Europe's is much more heavily bent towards passenger travel, whereas we're just not, right? It's just, like you had mentioned, it's the freight train companies that own most of the rail. Amtrak owns some here and there. There's Bight Line down in Florida, which owns their own rail. California High Speed Rail, which will own their own. But broadly, of that 140,000 miles of active rail, it's like 139,500 are owned by
it's
BNSF, Union Pacific.
All of it. Yeah.
It's like, it's almost all of it. All told, when we look at statistics from around the world, we can see that the United States has the most length of line of any single country in the world. So this is more rail lines, active rail lines than China, more than Russia, more than India. Again, just sort of illustrating that the United States has, it's a big train country here. We have a lot of rail.
Yeah, I think we think about it historically as a train country, but clearly you're illustrating that that's still the case. It's not just a historical thing.
Oh, and I wanted to have this little caveat here, and this is for the super train nerds. So I hope you guys enjoy this. This 140,000 miles, Hunter, is just for Class 1 rail lines, which is leaving about 1/3 of the total active train tracks in the United States out of the picture. So the United States has different classes of rail, and we talk a little bit about this inside our high-speed rail episode, so you can go listen to that. But basically, Class 1 is for sort of long-haul freight rail, but then there's sort of shorter-haul freight rail, which would be Class 2. All that's to say is there's actually more out there than the statistics I'm even giving to you. Most countries don't seem to break up their, based on the International Union of Railways, break up their rail quite like that. But the International Union of Railways did not classify route Class 2, so I didn't want to include in those statistics either.
Well, anyways, and then there's light rail to throw everything off as well, because that's where we'd get a little bit more of the commuters and a little bit more of the people. Totally. But those are trains, right? Basically.
They're trains. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Streetcars are anything that's on tracks is a train, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's really the defining feature of what is and what is not a train. For all these reasons, I think it's pretty clear that the United States, as I've already mentioned, is a train country. It's just not a passenger train country. Mm-hmm. But of course, many other places are. So let's talk a little bit more about passenger trains, who's doing what, and sort of where are people coming and going. We hinted at that in sort of the first part of today's episode. Now we're going to sort of dive a little bit more into those stats. Remind us again, Hunter, who is the most traveled passenger rail country in the world?
That was Japan, right?
It was Japan. So according to the International Union of Railways, Japan carries about 6.2 billion passengers per year. So
that's impressive. That's a lot of people.
This would be followed by India with about 3.5 billion, China with 2.6 billion, and then Germany with about 1.8 billion. Now, there's a caveat with this data, Hunter, and this is because the International Union of Railways does not necessarily track basically passenger rail with inside cities, your light rail systems, your subways, XYZ. So those kinds of things are sort of left as an aside when tabulating all this data. So you can kind of find that information, but combining them has proven to be challenging. I think they're sort of tracking things a little bit differently as well. And so it gets a little bit harder. So this would just be sort of intercity travel. So, if you're looking at India, how many people are going from Mumbai to Delhi, right? Japan, I guess, Tokyo to Kyoto, that kind of thing.
Example. Yeah.
Yep, for example. Do you want to hazard a guess at the United States annual passenger ridership?
So we were talking about what's over 6 billion in Japan, and so I'm supposed to guess what the United States is
per year. Yeah,
I see. I'm going to say 250 million.
You have a very rosy outlook on Amtrak's success as your city passenger transport. No, it's Amtrak as of, I believe this was 2022. I don't think it was 2023. I don't know if they've released those numbers yet. No, actually, I think it was 2023. I think I did find those numbers. Was at about 28 million people per year.
Right.
So that's low. That's
not so many. Yeah. That's much less.
Canada would be even less at about 1.5 million passengers.
Well, they got a lot
I don't have. Yeah. They have less people, but this would be less per capita overall.
Per capita. Too. So I see. Okay.
So this is, they have about 1/10 the amount of people as the United States.
That's right.
A little bit more than that, actually, probably about 1/9. This would be far less than that. So there's less rail transportation in Canada overall. I don't have data for Mexico, and we're going to talk about Mexico in a little bit, and there's reasons for that. But if we run through each continent, Asia overall moves the most amount of people with about 13 billion people annually. So this would be, Japan, Korea, China, India, wherever, all the different countries that are part of that. Thailand, XYZ. A lot of population. China obviously has been modernizing and extending their rail transportation for the last 20 years. India has been doing a lot of that same thing as well, and so it wouldn't surprise me if over the next 20 years, one of those two countries does surpass Japan, which has very impressive numbers, but is also a much smaller country in terms of population.
Right.
So
yes, I would expect that to change. Yeah.
Right. This would be followed by Europe with about 7 billion annually. Mm-hmm. So led by Germany, but not too far behind would be France and then eventually Spain and sort of the bigger countries based on population. It sort of follows that sort of line. I think Turkey's up there too.
Okay. Yeah.
And then we get to the Americas, which includes South America, right? So they're not breaking up North America and South America. The Americas overall has about 1.2 billion passenger rail transportation annually. Pretty impressive, I would say. It's not too far away from. I mean, I think if you're in the billion, you're probably doing something right.
Right.
This would actually be led by Brazil, which has nearly 900 million passengers in 2023, which I thought was. I mean, it sort of took me by surprise. I did not realize that was such a big mode of transportation down there.
A lot more than the United States.
A lot more than the United States. And just to, everybody likes to point out the United States geography as being a limiting factor. Brazil's a huge country, as is China.
Yeah. These are also giant places. So that doesn't necessarily explain everything. That the United States is big. Yeah.
So, and then we get to Africa, which has about 241 million annually.
Okay.
South Africa would lead here with about 133 million passengers annually. Though I wanted to point out that Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria all have annual ridership higher than the United States. They range from about the low 30s up to the high 40s. And I thought that was pretty interesting, especially because they're all sort of near each other. They're all inside the Northern African area. And I know that Morocco especially has been doing a lot of work on rail transportation. And I would be willing to guess that Algeria and Tunisia has been doing something similar. And then finally, we have the Oceania region with about 40 million annually. And this is really just Australia. There's not really, I couldn't even really find any statistics for, at least not through the International Union of Railways for New Zealand. So,
wow. Okay.
And then obviously those small islands, maybe they have some very small rail transportation, but they're pretty small. And I don't think most of them do.
Yeah, that infrastructure is probably not highly developed.
Yeah, and it's, for some of those islands, for some of those islands that are really small, it's like, is there really an advantage to it over,
right.
A road and truck system? I don't know. Maybe there is, but maybe not enough. I don't know. So now, Hunter, we're going to shift our focus to North America because I find it really fascinating that the United States, Canada, and Mexico don't have better passenger rail. And we're going to dive into that a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and hit our last ad break. And then we're going to come back and we're going to dive deep into Amtrak, Via, and, well, Mexico's unique situation that they have going on. So we will be right back. And we're back. This is the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about trains today. We just ran through a bunch of statistics all about the various passenger rail. We talked about freight rail broadly. Now we're going to dive into North America. And specifically, we're going to talk about Amtrak. We're going to talk about Via up in Canada. And then we're going to talk about Mexico's unique situation. But let's start with Amtrak because it's where we're located here. We've already mentioned them a couple of times in today's episode. This is where we're going to do a little bit of rehashing from our old episode where we're going to talk a little bit about the history of how Amtrak came to be. Really kind of what's the deal with Amtrak? What are they? Why aren't they more successful? What are they doing? XYZ. So the basic structure of Amtrak, Hunter, is it's a semi-private corporation. Now, if you remember, we just did a whole episode on the U.S. Postal Service.
That's right.
And go listen to that. It's fascinating how USPS works. Amtrak sort of falls into a similar bucket as the U.S. Postal Service, where it's federally managed. It is technically federally owned. However, it's a corporation. It has to be profitable. It has to sort of, survive unto itself. All that kind of stuff.
It's expected to turn a profit somehow.
Right. I mean, or I don't even know if the expectation is there to turn a profit. Of course, if they want to expand, they have to.
Right.
But they have to sort of pay for themselves. Now they can get grants and to like do other things, and that's a whole other side. But overall, they sort of fall into that quasi-private, quasi-public entity, which is kind of like just a weird designation.
Yeah.
Amtrak is required by law to operate a national railroad route system, passenger route system. And Amtrak today has presence in 46 of the 48 contiguous states, as well as the District of Columbia, with only throughway connecting services in Wyoming. And unfortunately, South Dakota, I'm very sorry to say this, but you don't have any service at all.
Wow.
It actually, it's kind of weird. There's just nothing there for you.
Yeah. Well, I guess you got to drive or something. Yeah. Take a plane.
I don't know. It's a pretty... in terms of population density, not a lot of people there. I don't know if necessarily there's a high demand for it. But if there is, that would be really cool, if you guys got a route. Just saying. Alaska is not served by Amtrak, but does have a passenger rail service called Alaska Railroad, which handles both freight and passenger services. I thought that was really cool to find. Apparently, there's plans to eventually connect it to Canada, and then therefore connecting it to the wider North American sort of rail network. But that hasn't been realized as far as I can tell. So I think these are long.
Does it seem like a big priority? Yeah.
Probably not. But I'll say this. I was poking around on the Alaska Railway, I think .com, whatever, the website. And I was like, ooh, these look like fun. They have like little like trip packages. You could take like this trip that goes along the Alaska coast, like takes 2 days. And then, you can be in a hotel or something. I was like, ooh, I think I might want to do this one day.
That sounds super interesting. Yeah.
Very cool. Amtrak services roughly fall into three groups. There are short haul services. This would be, things such as the Northeast Corridor, right? The Acela. Then there are state supported short haul services that sort of are outside of sort of that area, which would be things like the Cascades, which we also talked about, area that runs from Eugene, Oregon through Portland and up to Seattle. And then there are the medium and long haul services, which would be, this sort of national network. And this would be something that connects, for example, here in Portland, we can take one of these long hauls from Portland down to San Diego. I think it's called the Coast Starlight. It runs from, the Cascades runs all the way up to Vancouver, BC.
Right.
The Coast Starline runs from Seattle down to San Diego. So it's not international. Cascade is. You can also take one here from Portland over to Chicago. It's called the Empire Builder. These take a long time, as you can imagine. We're going to talk a little about some of these times.
Pretty revealing name for the railroad.
I know, right? Yeah, absolutely. Amtrak receives federal funding for the vast majority of its operations, including the central spine of the Northeast Corridor. However, again, it's still required to, make up its own money, right? So it receives federal funding, but it's required to
supposed to cover its costs. Yeah,
exactly. In addition to the federally funded routes, Amtrak partners with transportation agencies in 18 states to operate other short and medium haul routes outside of the Northeast Corridor. And so just other things sort of going around. I believe they're trying to establish one along the Front Range corridor in Colorado that would formally connect Wyoming into the network, because I think it would start in Cheyenne, go down through Denver, I think, end in Pueblo, Colorado. All of this came to be in 1970 with the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970. And so leading to this moment, intercity passenger rail around the country was really struggling. And so they were kind of going out of business. We're going to talk a little bit about this, but this is coming at a time when planes are sort of the new, hot transportation item, right? It's becoming like an actual thing for people to board train or planes. And then it's also coming at a time when the interstate highway system is sort of finally being realized.
Yeah, right. By the that accelerated through the 1950s, and so that's well established. And passenger train took a hit because of that.
Right. And so as these passenger rail services were sort of going out of business, Amtrak was founded to sort of collectively grab all these things and pull them into a single federally sort of run service. And it was originally opt-in, right? Intercity rail transportation services didn't have to, say, we'll hand over our stuff, but most did, because again, they weren't profitable. They was like, okay, we can either do this or we can just kind of stop existing.
Right.
There's basically the railroads that chose not to join this system were required to continue operating their existing passenger service until 1975. And then they could go through a process to sort of be allowed to continue, further. Most did not. And so today we don't really have any independent passenger rail services, aside from what we've already mentioned, which was, it's really just Brightline. That would be intercity, right? And that runs from Miami up to Orlando, Florida. Now they're trying to do a service between Las Vegas and Los Angeles.
Okay.
There'll be others.
Yeah.
Same company, Brightline. Yeah. There'll be others that, are going through the process of being constructed, right? So the California High-Speed Rail, that'll be independent from Amtrak. But broadly, the vast majority of passenger rail in the United States is Amtrak today.
Right.
Of the 26 passenger rail services that were in operation at the time, so around this early 1970s, 20 of them opted to join Amtrak. Now, in some respects, Hunter, I would argue, and we've sort of already made this point, I would argue that the United States is a little bit of a victim of its own geography. When we start to think about when rail transportation, intercity rail transportation was coming online, back in the early part of the 1900s, even in the late 1800s, it was kind of the only way to get around. And so we built this vast network of rail systems that were built on sort of older technology that would connect various cities to each other. But at some point, the country's vast expanse got upgraded with the interstate highway system and better and more efficient and cheaper airfare. And this all sort of happened at a sort of a pivotal time when all these rail companies weren't able to upgrade their systems at cost to start making way for better technologies, such as what was happening in the Japan, such as the Shinkansen, which started coming online sort of in the 70s as well.
Well, that's a set of decisions that were made. So things could have played out differently, and there could have been basically some kind of way to subsidize the passenger rail system if that was seen as a priority. But as you mentioned,
But it just wasn't.
the automobile really became very attractive to people here. In particular, the interstate highway system gave people venue in order to get different places. And then air travel, like, again, we did this whole episode on it and talking about how suddenly people are increasingly able to afford to go long distances. And so that's what they opt to do.
Absolutely. And we talked about this already. So we talked a little bit about sort of the amount of time that it takes to get from place to place by train.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So again, we've established that those sort of mid-distance trips are really the sweet spot for trains, even when you're talking about high-speed rail.
Yes.
Now, of course, for freight rail, long distances doesn't really matter. Freight trains, obviously they have schedules to keep, but they don't have to compete with time in the same way that passengers, right. That the passenger rail does, right?
Yeah,
right.
I mean, the freight, people might complain about getting their stuff late, but the freight itself isn't complaining, right? It's not complaining about the experience. Where passengers, they're going to do that.
Exactly. And I would argue that most people don't even recognize if there's been a delay for their freight, right?
Right.
You might go to IKEA here in Portland, and they might be out of stock in some items that you were looking for, but you're probably not going to blame.
Yes.
You're not going to blame the freight rail line for that because you're just so far disconnected from it. You might just be like, "Oh, that really sucks. When are they going to get this back in stock?" Oh, blah 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 blah. Grumble, grumble, grumble. I have an example here, sort of illustrates sort of this time gap difference that really makes this challenging for Amtrak to compete. Right, so. A flight from Portland, again, it's where we're located here, to San Francisco, is about 1 hour and 50 minutes total flight time. With airport time, you can pad a few hours, before and after, right? Before go through security.
I've gone from my house in Portland to a friend's place in San Francisco in about 4 hours door to door. It can be done,
right?
Yeah,
it can be done. Yeah, it adds a little bit of time, but not an excess amount of time. Mm-hmm. An Amtrak train, so if you board that Coast Starlight in Portland, you take that down to San Francisco, that's going to be 19 hours, nearly 19 hours.
Yeah, that's
a hard sell. It's a hard sell for.
I mean, if you're going for the weekend, then you pretty much have to get back on the train and go home. I mean, it takes up the entire time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to point this out as well. The cost difference is not really on Amtrak's side either. In fact, and unfortunately, Amtrak is often more expensive than airfare, which I think is kind of wild.
Yeah, that's amazing that that's the case. So you'd have to be somebody who just refuses to fly or who wants the train experience.
Right. And then it's sort of like, they lean into sort of the luxury aspect of it, and you can get these sleeper cars, and you can have like a really nice, like, sort of trip. And it becomes sort of the train trip is sort of the trip, right? It's
part of the adventure. When you're flying, you're just going there. Yeah.
Right. So for all these reasons, the United States, I think, is, in Amtrak are sort of, inside this weird area where it's really hard for them to compete. Mm-hmm. And like you had pointed out, during the 1970s, when all this money was being invested in the interstate highway system, into modernizing, airports around the country as people were flying more, there was a significant lack of any sort of investment into rail transportation. In fact, at that time, the federal government was trying to consolidate all of them and just keep the lights on, basically. And so, I would argue the United States sort of had missed a crucial period of time that other places did not miss. And that's part of the reason why it's just lagged so far behind today. But let's turn our attention to our northern neighbors, so Canada. Okay. Their passenger train service, Via. So Via has a very similar story to Amtrak, as it turns out. It was established in 1977, and the creation of Via Rail was initiated by the Canadian government to consolidate and manage intercity passenger rail services previously run by Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Railway, which were also facing issues with staying solvent. In the late 1970s, the Canadian National and Pacific Railway were primarily freight operators that basically didn't want to do passenger rail anymore because, again, they weren't. It was a money loser for them. And so, like Amtrak, the service pulled everything in and started managing it themselves. And also, like Amtrak, the service largely has struggled and slogged along with underfunding, difficult routes, poor service reliability, and all that kind of stuff. So today, Via Rail operates a network of intercity, regional, and long-distance routes across Canada. So you can take a route from Vancouver, BC to Toronto or Montreal if you wanted to. That is possible, just like it's possible for you to take a train route from Portland to Chicago or New York. Totally possible to do those. I think the longest one in the United States might be from Seattle to Washington, D.C., I believe, like a singular route. I think there's one.
That's a big trip. Yeah.
Yeah. Long trip. Via's most notable service is kind of similar to the United States, right? So Acela is the most notable and most profitable service in the United States. Connects Washington, D.C. basically up to Boston and all the cities in between. Via's is the Quebec City Windsor corridor. And so this is its most popular route, which makes sense because it connects Canada's two largest cities to each other, Toronto and Montreal, as well as the cities of Windsor, which is kind of, it's an internationally, border there, but it's basically within the Detroit metro area. So there's a lot of people there.
Yep.
It's Sarnia, London, Kingston, Ottawa, which is Canada's capital, and then Quebec City, obviously. In 2017, so this is my latest stats, this corridor service accounted for 95% of Via's ridership and 77% of its revenue. So, showcasing that this is probably the Northeast corridor, because it's very similar for Amtrak, right? Northeast corridor is basically the only profitable route in Amtrak.
Yeah, and this is where the population is concentrated in both cases.
Right. Via Rail's flagship long distance service is the Canadian, which runs between Toronto and Vancouver, BC.
Okay.
And that's very scenic, right? You can go through some areas of, for example, the Canadian Rockies, Banff area that you're just not going to see anywhere else in the world unless you're on that train. So now, just as we conclude our episode today, Hunter, I want to talk a little bit about Mexico, because Mexico is kind of its whole other thing. And I didn't really want to leave them out of this discussion. So Mexico does have some very limited passenger rail transportation systems, but nothing too extensive. And it's almost entirely focused on tourism, as it turns out.
Okay. So not a lot of freight? Is that what you're saying?
There is freight, yes.
There is
but we're talking about the passenger systems of North America.
Okay. Yeah.
There is freight, right? So there's freight that sort of crisscrosses. It's not as extensive as either the United States or Canada. Canada has a big extensive system as well. Mexico has some of that going on as well. But
so you're saying it's more tourists than as opposed to people who live locally who are taking the trains. Okay.
Right. For example, like there's not really a route that connects Guadalajara to Mexico City, which would be, I would assume, would be primarily a, Mexican citizen sort of, service rather than any sort of tourist service. Right. So there's a few lines that run. There's the Chihuahua al Pacifico, which is a tourist train that runs through Copper Canyon, which is a magnificent canyon if you ever get a chance to see it. Very similar to in sort of depth and grandioseness to the Grand Canyon inside Arizona. There's the Tequila Express, a tourist train which runs from Guadalajara, Jalisco to a tequila distillery in Amatitlan.
Yeah, that could only be a tourist train. Yeah, with a name like that.
It could only be. There's Line Z, which is a passenger train service on the Tren Interoceanico, which connects the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean on the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, I think is how it's pronounced. Apparently, according to sort of what I could find, this train service actually uses old Amtrak Amfleets and ex-British Rail Intercity 125. So I thought that was kind of interesting that some of the older Amtrak trains are still running down there, connecting that.
That is interesting. Yeah.
This, by the way, the Tren Interoceanico is primarily a freight route, right? It's kind of creating a parallel to the Panama Canal, only, ships will unload their stuff onto a train there, and they'll take it to the Pacific side or vice versa.
I see.
Kind of interesting. And then finally, there's the Tren Maya. Have you ever heard about the Tren Maya, Hunter?
I've not heard of the Tren Maya, but I'm intrigued. What's going on?
It is interesting. So the Tren Maya is an intercity railway in Mexico that traverses the Yucatan Peninsula.
Mm.
And so
that
construction of this
is the Mayan area. Yeah.
Mayan area, yes. So construction began in 2020, and the operation of it began in 2023. Now, it doesn't go too far. It sort of creates like a little route inside that area. The railway begins in Cancun International Airport, travels southwest towards Palenque and Chiapas via two routes that sort of encircle this peninsula. And that's kind of it. But I kind of want to talk about this line because it was quite, the construction of it was quite contentious. And I think when most of us, those of us who are transportation nerds anyway, think about trains, we often like them. We often like, oh, this is really good. Let's let people out of their cars. Let's get people out of planes because those are not as efficient, and trains are kind of cool. X, Y, Z, myriad of reasons. So I think on paper, most people will probably look at this Tren Maya and think, oh, that's kind of nice, even though it's just for tourists. It does all of these things that I just ran through. However, as it turns out, the train route, because it's trying to get people to, various places of touristy interest, it had to bulldoze a lot of jungle area, and jungle area that was particularly inhabited by the endangered jaguar species down there. So, there was a lot of environmental issues going around about that. Obviously, losing jungle in this day and age, not necessarily seen as a good thing anymore. A long time ago, it was, clearing out jungle was definitely preferred. So that's kind of an interesting. I think we talked about this inside our Amazon rainforest episode.
Yes,
how Brazil was sort of managing it. Yeah. But then also, the other big part of this is that the area it's traveling on is still, per its name, it takes place sort of in the home of the ancient Mayan culture, which means there's still a lot that hasn't been discovered around this Mayan culture that this train might very well be bulldozing over. So there was a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists basically, from within Mexico and from outside, basically saying, you don't know what you're potentially destroying. And especially, starting construction in 2020 and ending in 2023, that's a fast construction time.
It is.
There's just a lot there. So I thought it was really fun.
The tensions of tourism is something that's come up in a lot of our episodes. And this is yet another illustration that, increasingly people in different parts of the world, and it could be wealthier or poorer parts of the world, are dependent on tourism. And so there's a lot of changes that happen in places to facilitate that. But that comes at some real costs, and you've just pointed out what some of those are.
Absolutely. So I've not been to the Yucatan Peninsula. I've not been to Cancun. I think if I were to go, would I want to board the Tren Maya and like have it take me into the jungle and see all this really rad stuff? Yeah, obviously. I think that would be really, really cool. As somebody who is a bona fide train nerd, I don't know if I could pass up the opportunity. It also travels at a pretty decent clip of around 100 miles per hour.
Wow. Yeah.
That said, I can also understand sort of, especially for a lot of the Mexicans of the area who are like, hey, this is areas that we cherish and are we value as part of our heritage. Especially maybe some of the indigenous peoples who still live in the area. I couldn't find too much information about them that, maybe felt like they were getting bulldozed a little bit, which
this is not helping us out.
Literally probably were.
Not the choice we would have made. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's about it. That's about all I have for trains, Hunter. There's a lot more I could say. I feel like there's always more to say. But I guess with that, Hunter, who are you? Tell people where they can find you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portlandist, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. Those are done with David Banas. And I'm co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything.
Yeah, and my name is Jeff Gibson, co-host of this podcast with Hunter, obviously. You can also find me on YouTube. That's Geography by Jeff. Just go over there, search for it. Be fine. If you liked what you heard today, you thought it was interesting learning about trains and all the different train systems around the world, please like and subscribe to us on YouTube, or go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, whatever, and rate and review us there. We really appreciate seeing those. We have pretty good ratings, so you can add to it and make us feel happy a little bit. If you want this delivered straight to your email inbox, you can do that. It's just geographyiseverything.substack.com. You don't need to pay anything. Just go over there, subscribe. Comes to your email box every Tuesday. Easy way to get access to it. And I include both an audio link and the YouTube link, so you can sort of pick and choose whatever you want, whatever you're feeling for the day. Next week, Hunter, what are we doing next week?
I think I'm going to call it an audible on that one, because there's an episode coming up that I've been working on for a while that I just have to do a great job on, and so I think it has to get put off a little bit further. So I think we're going to move up Easter Island. I think
Easter Island. That's going to be a really interesting one.
Yeah, it's a place that's captured my imagination for a long time. And I think not everybody knows too much about it. They maybe heard of it. They know some of the really famous statues, the moai that were built there. But yeah, we'll get into some detail and talk about Geography's Easter Island.
I think it's going to be a fantastic episode. It's also, we occasionally do these ones that are like really situated on a place, which I think is always really fun.
Yeah.
But I don't think we've done a place. I mean, we did Hawaii, but we haven't done a place that's, I think, as small and as kind of mysterious as Easter Island.
Yeah, no, this will be focusing on a much smaller place. And there's a lot of interesting stories that come into play with this place. So we'll get to explore some of those.
Great. Well, come back next week to learn all about Easter Island. And I guess until then, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.